Hi, this is another development update for MegaSplat. MegaSplat was released to the asset store just last week. I've been working very hard on doing some improvements and wanted to show them off. Here we are in the example scene once again. If I go to the Vertex Painter now, one of the things you'll notice is the new brushing interface. So basically, I've reworked the selection when you're working with a multi-layer shader. You now can choose top or bottom for which shader, and then you can choose which type of brush you want, which is basically the single brush is, a single texture at a time. Cluster brushes are collections of textures, and then the blended brush paints on both layers at once. So this is a little more easy, I think, to understand. Additionally, there are now hot keyboard shortcuts for this. So if you press M, you will change the mode of the brush. If you press L, you'll toggle the layer. And then you can use the arrow keys to move around the selection. So that should make it a little bit faster for people when they're busy painting. I would have used Tab, but you can't actually override that because of the way Unity uses those keys. One of the things you may have already noticed is that this UI has been redone visually. All the clusters actually show a preview now with the names on them, which is much nicer than the previous control. So it's a lot easier to tell what you're actually going to be painting when you paint. And then the blended mode actually uses that preview rendering to give you a preview of the sort of blended brush you're creating as you work on that brush. So, as I change and select different textures and I say, oh, great, I want this moss with, shore sand here. As I change these noise functions, you can see it actually updates the little preview here so that when I paint, that's exactly what I'm going to get. So that's a whole lot nicer. That has been reworked through the entire interface through the cluster library and everything to use these previews, which is a big improvement. So there are two other really huge features that I've added. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Color to Splat tool. What this does is allow you to rapidly paint a landscape without without brushes, just do it procedurally. And the way you access this is you go over to this utility panel, and MegaSplat will install into the utility panel this Splat from Color Map here. And what this takes is a macro texture, which is some form of guide texture, and then this configuration for mapping a given color to a given brush in the system. So if I select the macro texture here, and what I have is I have a guide texture, and you can see that this is a very, here I have a bigger version. It's a colorful, low-res texture that I'm going to use to decide which brush strokes go where over the entire map at once. And to do that, I need to create a configuration file. And then I need to choose, after I've done that configuration, a way to map how to get the UVs. So in this case, I'm just going to use the source UVs, but you can also use world space projections to do this so that if you don't have UVs on your mesh and you still want to map this data on, you can just use like the world space XZ, for instance, to do top-down mapping. To create one of these configuration files, what I do is I right-click and then I go create, and in the MegaSplat folder here, we have color to splat config. So if you create one of these, you give it some name, whatever you want to call it, and then you go over to the inspector here. What this will do is ask for a texture config. So we can choose our diffuse texture, and then we can start creating mappings. And the way this works is that when you create a mapping, you basically say for a given source color, so let's choose our source color. So let's say we want, and I like to use the little eyedropper tool for this. So this little eyedropper tool in Unity. I come over here, I select this sort of yellowish color, and then great, there's my source color. So wherever we find that color, when that color is the closest value that we have in this list, then we're going to either apply to the top or bottom layer a single or a cluster brush, or we can use the blended brush. And this is where blended brushes are super useful. So for instance, I might decide that that yellow area, I would like to be a combination of shore sand and let's do the regular sand. And then I can tweak this setting here to control how much of each we get. And you can see the preview is really a nice thing to have now. I can tweak these noise parameters. I can also um, add additional mappings. So once I've created this noise brush setting, I can basically just create another one of these, and I continue down my list. I select maybe some sort of green here and say what I really want is, again, I'm going to use a blended brush, and I'm going to say that you are moss, and let's go for a little bit of the shore sand we had before, which is really kind of a rocky type thing. And what I'm going to do is push this over so that it favors the moss heavily. So now we'll just get a few of those, the shore sand we had in the previous one. And what you'll notice about this terrain is that we get this light green, right around the yellow areas. So this will create a nice transition. And I can continue adding these mappings, basically. So I'm just going to let me just add 2 more here. And let's go ahead and select our next color and say that the dark green we get here, oops, I have to hit that little selector first. So let's just say the dark green. For this, let's use another blended brush. You could do sort of overlapping, areas with the other cluster brushes, but and this time I'm going to do the moss again, but I'm going to start blending in a little bit of this rock wall. And so I can maybe a little less of this rock wall. And again, I could change the frequencies and amplitudes of these noise functions to get a sort of a different look. What isn't necessarily apparent here is scale, because this is on a 1 meter sphere. So we'll just do one more, and we'd probably want a lot more of these in a real configuration. And let's do this brown or sort of orangey texture here. And let's say that that is going to represent, let's go actually to the blended brush once again and say that this is going to represent a little bit of moss and maybe a lot of that cat, not rock. Well, rock dirt's kind of nice. I think I want the rock cliff here, which has a little bit of this kind of moss in it anyway, and I really want to push it towards that rock cliff, but to still have a little bit of the moss in there. And now let's just add one more config. And for the final one, we're going to select the white areas here. Or sorry, the gray. Oops, and I need to redo that. Go here, select the little eyedropper, go up to these gray areas. And for this one, I am going to use a little bit of that rock wall. And then there is a nice, maybe I'll use nope, not that ice. The ice and snow one actually should work pretty well for that, and I'll leave that to be like that. So we've set up our mapping now. In a real mapping, we'd probably use a lot more layers, but you can use as many as you want. And so now, and again, you can roll up these brushes if you want to make the UI a little bit more manageable. I think this UI could actually use a little more work, but it is good enough for now, and I will continue to work on it later. So now we can go back to our vertex painter. Let me just bring this window over here so you can see everything. And we're going to select all of our meshes at once. And then what we're going to do is come over here and select that color to splat config. And of course I have 2 of the same name, so now I'm just going to drag the one I want in here to make sure I get the one from the tutorial. So now we can just hit bake and give it a second, and we've painted the entire landscape based on these parameters. So you can see Down here where the yellow was painted, we're getting little bits of the sand in here. We're getting that shore texture, and then as we make our way up into those green colors, we're getting more of these other textures blended in um, until we finally get up to the snow right on the top. So this is a very fast way to get a quick paint job over your entire terrain using parameters. If you really spend some time tuning all of this, you can get really complex effects. And remember that each of these is actually painting those texture clusters. So if you make texture clusters, if we go back to the editor for that, we go to the custom tab here and we look at one of our clusters. So these clusters were the automatically created ones where they're just 3 variations of the same texture and it's using noise to decide which one to blend between. But remember that if you actually go to the config here and edit the texture clusters, you can make more advanced texture clusters than this. So I'll go to my diffuse here, and if you open up the cluster library on one of these, like for instance this wet mud, you'll see that right now this is just 3 textures with a noise, and again we have our little preview here, but we could actually switch this to be based on angle or height, and so you could actually set up one of these texture cluster layers that's going to vary based on the polygon's facing or its height in your overall model's size, and then get variation within this. And this can just be assigned to one of the colors in that map. So yellow could mean, oh, we're going to use sand, but we're actually going to ramp it off on the hills based on the angle of the normal. So combined, you can get some really advanced mappings. You can get lots of variation and very quickly rough paint your entire landscape, and then spend your time really going in and making the areas that you really care about unique, rather than spending your time just getting the base coat going. So yeah, so that's a really cool feature, and I think it'll come in really useful and allow people to get a lot of work done really fast. Again, these are stored, these mappings you store in their own objects, which is a nice thing because it means you can save these mappings and reuse them and come up with different ones for different situations and apply them very quickly, and create little libraries of these mappings as well. One other thing I did not mention before we move on to the next bit is some changes I did in the actual texture array. So if we close up the library here of all the clusters, you'll notice that there's now this preview rendering info box, and this thing actually accepts a pointer to a normal config and a packing mode, and that's basically just so that when we do those preview renders, we can actually use the normal maps and the packing mode information you use to get a better looking preview render. A lot of the look of a texture comes from normal and specular, so having that in the preview is actually really nice. You don't have to set these if you don't. It'll just render it all diffuse, and it'll look very flat. You'll still be able to tell what you're doing, but it won't look quite as nice in those previews as it does when you do set them. And so that's probably worth doing because it makes your previews look a lot more like they're really going to look on the terrain. Okay, so we're going to go over to another big feature I've added, which is integration with the first non-MegaSplat application, which is the Amplify Shader Editor. Now, I'm going to be using a few nodes in this that are not in Amplify yet. They are putting out a patch now that has equivalents to these nodes. I submitted some stuff to them so that we had a little more information. And I have not gotten a code review for them from them yet on the actual MegaSplat node. So I want to see what they say, because there's a bunch of little things in there that could probably be better because I don't know their code as well as I do my own, of course. But I feel like it's good enough for you guys to be able to play around with, and if I fix those things up or make them better, it's going to be fine. So the first node that I'm going to talk about is a MegaSplat sampler. And so if you drag this out, this gives you the capability to MegaSplat things exactly like my shaders do. And then you can decide, do different things with the data than my shader does. So that gives you a lot more configurability. So usually the first thing we want to do is name the property. So I'm going to call it diffuse. And then we can go over here and select an actual texture array. So I'm going to select my diffuse texture array. And then this works somewhat like a normal texture sampler from this point. You can set, what is the default value? Maybe I want the default value to be white. Okay. So then what you do is you need to basically give it some UV coordinates, which are just normal UVs like you normally do. And let's see here. Let's just go get our text coord. Oh, sorry, that's the text coordinates, which we will get into in a moment. They put their UV node. Not intimately familiar with this shader graph like I am some other ones. That's probably going to be under texture here. You could pan those if you wanted to, make an animated one, rotate them, etc. Well, it will. I believe it will assume the regular UVs, just because I'm not having trouble finding that UV node right now. You can put a contrast amount in. This is equivalent to the contrast node that, or contrast slider that we see in my shaders. I'm just going to hard code it to 0.5 for right now. So you can plug that in. And I believe there's right here, there's a contrast value if you don't plug that in. So that's nice because you don't need to add this node unless you were, for instance, letting people change that contrast value. And then there's an input for what's called resample data, which I'll get into in a second. So the main thing here is texture choice. Now, in my shader, what I actually do is drive the first layer's texture choice from the vertex color. And so if we get our vertex color here and drag that out, we use the vertex colors alpha to be my texture choice. And so now when I paint, I'm going to choose this, the texture that's specified in the vertex alpha. And then what we can do is take our color and go ahead and put that into albedo, just like we normally would. Now what we need to do is sample the height maps. Sample the normal maps. So we go back, get our sampler node from MegaSplat, and since this does a significant amount of work to figure out how to extract the data from the texture cluster, from the texture array, we don't want to redo that work. So what we can actually do is just pass this resample data into here. And that means that this node won't basically redo all of that work all over again. And so then we can change this to be a normal here. We can change the default to be a bump map, and we can grab our normal array here. And there we go. And so now we have our normal sampler set up. Now notice here we didn't bother to plug in the texture choice again because the resample data will come with all of that. So then what we can do, this is a sort of standard normal. And what we need to do is unpack that because normals, when they come in, are in 0 to 1 space, and we need them to actually be in a -1 to 1 space. And additionally, Unity supports texture compression formats that are only for normals. So if we're using the standard normal packing that Unity uses, we need to unpack that and plug it into our normal map. I'm going to make my window a little bigger here. And so we can continue doing this for other samples. And if we want to set up multiple layers, what we can do is grab this blend layer node here. So what this is a node that, given two height values and what I call a slope, which is basically the blend weight between those two textures, it will actually, and a contrast, it will actually do a height map based blend between those two layers. So if you've ever worked with height map based blending in a shader graph before, this is basically the node, similar to the node you would use there. So if you set up another layer where you basically perform this whole operation again using a different texture choice index, then you could blend those two together with this node, and you would just treat this like sort as the input to a lerp node. So uh, I will just load up one of these finished. It's basically a full 2-layer shader and show it to you, so I can sort of explain all the bits of it, which is going to go a little faster than what I'm doing right here. So in the examples folder, let's see here, we have, actually it might, nope, front-end shaders. Oh, I have not moved it into the project yet. Let me just do that really quick. And I have a little not ready folder here where I'm working on stuff, and then I move it over to when it's done. But here we see MegaSplat 2-layer, and this is effectively the equivalent of a 2-layer MegaSplat shader using MSEO packing in this case, but you can do whatever packing you want. And so if we look at this, I zoom in, you'll see that the first thing I'm doing is driving the texture choice for the second layer here. This is the second layer, is diffuse 2. I'm driving the texture choice from the text chord 3's W component. So this is the same mapping that MegaSplat uses. And then the X component here is going into this new node that I added called vertex to fragment. And what this does is just say, look, I need this data in the fragment shader from the vertex shader, and allows you to marshal that over to the pixel shader. And then that's going into this height map based blending node here, which I'm breaking with my random clicking, and is basically the slope. So now essentially whatever I paint into UV3s in the vertex data X channel, a 0 to 1 value, will be the blend between layer 1 and layer 2. And what the MegaSplat brushes do is just hide a lot of this from you and let you just paint, right? But really what they're doing is storing information in the vertex data in text chord 3 about which texture you're painting and what is the blend between the 2 layers. And then the chain down here looks like what we set up before. Oh, here we go, texture coordinate, that's what they call it. So here I scaled the texture coordinate up by 3, just for fun. I took that vertex color alpha and used that for my texture choice. I drove my contrast. I'm also driving the contrast on this height lerp node over here. And in this case, I resampled, using the resample data, I sampled a normal map and the MSEO data there. And then I actually just lerp between those, between the outputs of those, between the 2 layers normal map, the 2 layers MSEO textures, and the 2 layers diffuse textures. So I lerp between each of them using the output of this height blend. And then I unpack that normal because, again, you have to do this with normals in Unity. And if I'd used, for instance, the tighter packing, then I would have had to have done the unpacking there. And then for the MSEO texture, I had to break the components apart so I could get at them because the lerp control doesn't give me the 4 outputs. But then you can see this is just going into the final metallic value, the final smoothness, the final occlusion value for each one. So yeah, so it doesn't, if you're familiar with shader graphs, this should be mostly similar to using a texture sampler, but it actually samples out of the array using the MegaSplat technique. And you could come in here and you could come up with your own texture packings. You could, add alpha support if you want to use alpha map surfaces, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this is really cool. I think this opens up a lot of possibilities that I'm never going to be able to cover in all the shaders. Like I can write, these giant mega shaders that try to fill out every possible thing that users want to do, but it's unlikely I'm ever going to provide everything that people would want to do. If you want to provide a tint color or something like that, then this is going to be a lot easier than going in and, writing full shaders like I've done for the included shaders. Yeah, so check out Amplify Shader Editor if you haven't. It's pretty awesome. I think when they get their previews working, it will probably be headed towards being the better shader editor on the Asset Store because it is being actively worked on. And yeah, if you have any questions, ask me in the thread. hopefully this doesn't scare you off. If you've worked with a lot of shader graphs, this is actually not that complex. So, so this gives you all the ability of MegaSplat's, 256 texture access and filtering in a nice little node. So you don't have to understand how all that stuff actually works. Yeah, so there were a bunch of other minor changes or fixes. I'm just going to bring up my notes here and just make sure I'm getting them. I did change the scale around on the shader, so that's one thing that may break existing scale values. And if you go, and this is on the per texture scaling here, so when this is on or when flow mapping is on, because it uses it, you now have a scale range. And so this is the min-max scale of the scale slider. So now when you slide this around, it's going to go, when you slide this value around, it's going to be how much of a scale, are we doing in the scale range. So it's going to go between 1 and 2 instead of going between, what it used to go before was between 0.5 and 2. So now if you need a 10x scale range, you can do that. Yeah, so that should work a lot better for people that want to have wildly different scales and things like that. Let's see what else we've got on the list. I gave triplanar mapping its own scale just because they tend to be so wildly different than the regular scales that when you flip back and forth, it just made things look broken. I think that covers most of it. And then I fixed a bunch of bugs. So turns out the shader wasn't working on metal-based iOS hardware, so I fixed that. I had to define some sampler stuff because my shaders use features that aren't macro-defined yet in Unity for their samplers. There was some lighting and specular response inconsistencies between different shader versions that are now fixed. I also added support for the PS4 while I was in there doing metal. I don't really have a way to verify this as I don't have a PS4 dev kit available. I'm not doing console stuff anymore, but in theory it should all work. And then I did a pretty big optimization to a specific mode that I use a lot, which is this mode where it crossfades into a distance texture. So now what actually happens is when it actually reaches the point where the splat maps have all faded out, it actually just samples the macro texture, which means that when you have a large scene like this, this could get very expensive on texture axes, especially if you have really different stuff painted over here and you've got to sample all those different textures, even though they're in a low MIP. Well, now everything that's beyond probably about right here is not doing any splat mapping anymore. It's just sampling that macro texture. And so I don't have to pay the cost of doing any of the splat maps beyond the distance in which they're noticeable. So that's a pretty big optimization if you're using this crossblend feature, and should be a win for everyone. So yeah, so I hope you like this update. It's got a lot of stuff in it, and let me know on the forums, and I will talk to you all later. Thanks for watching. Bye.